Hello all, I hope you're all doing well. I'm happy to say that we completed another cycle of going through and reading the Torah, the 5 books. Tomorrow we'll be starting again with Genesis, which is very exciting. The book in Genesis in general is a very, very exciting book. And since we do this every year, it's an invitation to participate, watch, learn, dig deeper, and by doing so, get to expand our relationship with God, and of course, understand what He wants from us a little better every time. The more we dig, the more we learn, the more we spend time learning these holy words. It only benefits us because these are the words of the living God. And so we are moving forward with the portion of Bereshit, right? Genesis. And there's obviously a tremendous amount of topics that one could go into over here. I would like to talk a little about the sin of Adam. And so, as we know, the sin really of Adam occupies a central place in the Torah and in general in human thought. And over many generations, there's been countless interpretations that have been offered, right? Some within the spirit of the Torah, and others, I would say, like our Christian brothers and sisters, who I believe are profoundly misunderstanding its meaning. Now, Christianity really turned Adam, or at least generally turned Adam's sin into this doctrine of inherited guilt, right? Really making every human being internally stained by a transgression that's really not even their own, right? Judaism, however, understands that the story needs to be looked at entirely differently. Well, what we don't view Adam's sin as a personal guilt carried out by all humanity, but it's really a condition of existence itself, right? We live in a fallen world, and this is what we were born into, and our mission is to elevate it, right? We enter a broken world, and we're not supposed to be despaired by it, but we actually are supposed to repair it. And as many of you know, our sages teach us that our purpose is tikkun olam, right? The rectification of creation itself. We were born, so to speak, in the sewer, right? But not because we're guilty, but because we were chosen ultimately to clean it. So we need to ask, what then was what was the sin, right? What was Adam's actual sin? Now, the Torah describes in a very symbolic and mysterious terms that eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, from which God obviously commanded him to refrain, ultimately. But if we look closely at the text, we note a paradox that actually emerges. God tells them, right, that from every tree of the garden you should surely eat, which does include, in principle, even the tree of knowledge. Right? Now, this prohibition wasn't permanent. It was actually a temporal condition. For on the day you eat, you shall surely die. Meaning, or in other words, right, that the tree of knowledge was actually meant to be eaten eventually, but only after Adam would first eat from the tree of life. Now, the order is extremely important, right? Knowledge without life leads ultimately to death. Right? Life has to precede understanding. Holiness has to precede wisdom. And only when the soul is actually rooted in the living source of holiness can it actually safely contain the power, the fire of knowledge itself. Right? Adam's sin wasn't one of just not listening, but is actually premature revelation, right? Or taking what wasn't supposed to be taken now, but actually meant to be taken later. He reversed the divine order by doing this. And instead of allowing life and sanctity and the inner depth really to precede the intellect, he chose knowledge first. And by doing so, that knowledge becomes destructive. Right? The garden's wisdom is not forbidden forever. It was supposed to be approached through the gateway of holiness. And our sages really teach us that when in the Midrash it says that when Adam ate from the Geffen, right, which is the grapevine, this is the very same fruit which we use to sanctify the Sabbath with wine. And his mistake was was like we said, tasting it too early on Friday before the holiness of the Sabbath actually descended. And if we had waited for the Sabbath the day that is supposed to symbolize the harmony between heaven and earth, this act then would have been a mitzvah. Then he would have been able to eat from this tree. Now, the Kabbalists dive a little deeper, as they usually do, and they teach that Adam's sin, at its core, is actually a failure to sanctify the physical. Right? The serpent, this is according to their explanation, really represents not an external creature, but the human intellect itself. Right? The verse tells us that the serpent was more cunning, or in Hebrew it's arum, than all the beasts of the field. Arum, or armumi, means naked, calculating, detached. Right? This is really here to symbolize that the human being who uses wisdom without holiness, or desire without sanctity. And so the serpent's temptation was not carnal in that sense, but spiritual, right? To experience life apart from Hashem, apart from God, and to separate the act from its sacred source. And in this sense, Adam's sin was sexual, not in form, but in meaning, right? He united with Eve before their union had even become an act of holiness. Right? The serpent's venom, so to speak, is the stain he left on the human consciousness when intimacy, creativity, or knowledge are pursued without the proper divine infrastructure or awareness or scaffolding. Now, Judaism's greatest revelation really lies here. I don't want to say the greatest. A great revelation lies here, which is it doesn't deny the body or the senses, right? It actually sanctifies them. Where famously Aristotle called touch a disgrace, right? The Kabbalists actually call it sacred. And they taught us that this physical union, when done properly, in the proper orientation and with holiness, is really one of the most elevated acts that a human being could perform, right? And it really echoes creation itself, a man and a woman coming together and creating life. And really, holiness is not an escape from life, but it's actually illuminating life itself. Now, just as Adam's fall comes from like we said, a premature grasping, right, from trying to take the light before it was time, this is also humanity's struggle with timing and patience and really being, having our own restraints. And in our days, when we are really witnessing the miraculous release of the Israeli hostages, these are souls that were torn from the garden of life, and they were held in darkness and in horrible cruelty. And we are really reminded that creation itself is still very much in the process of being repaired. And each act of return, each life that's redeemed, is really a spark of the Garden of Eden that's being restored. And we are participating in the same cosmic mission that really started with Adam, to heal what was broken, to restore holiness into this world, and to ultimately let Hashem's light, right, dwell among the living, be with us. Now, this moment of release really reminds us that holiness has to be there to precede power, and that life has to come before knowledge, and that our truest strength ultimately as a people lies not in the dominion that we have, but in its sanctification, and in turning even suffering ultimately into renewal. And just as the Shabbat transforms labor itself into peace, I hope that this time will mark a beginning of our nation's healing ultimately. The release of all these captives, and of course we're still waiting for many of the bodies, but the restoration of divine life to the heart of the world ultimately. So I'm wishing us all a Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat of peace, Shabbat of life. Take care.